We all hear about the promise of renewable energy, right? A cleaner, brighter future. But for a lot of communities, that promise comes with some pretty big questions. We hear these concerns all the time, that wind and solar farms are unreliable, that they're a threat to wildlife, and maybe even a danger to our health. So what's the real story here? Today, we're going to try to separate the evidence from the anxiety and see what the data actually tells us about these common worries.
So, here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the big picture questions. Then, we're going to tackle the top 3 concerns, one by one: grid reliability, the impact on wildlife, and human health. And we'll wrap up by looking at this really fascinating factor that kind of shapes this entire debate: the power of our own perception.
All right, let's dive in. The whole idea behind renewables seems so simple. Clean, sustainable energy for everyone. But the second a new project gets proposed, the conversation suddenly gets, well, a lot more complicated. And it's totally natural to ask, what are the hidden costs here?
And that really is the core question, isn't it? To answer it, we're not going to rely on anecdotes or what you might hear online. We're going to dig into the actual scientific studies and the official reports to see what the evidence has to say about grid stability, wildlife, and our own health.
First up, reliability. It's the big one. The sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't always blow. So does adding renewables into our grid make our power supply dangerously unstable?
Well, to answer that, we have to start with a fact that might actually surprise you. No power source runs 100% of the time. Not one. Every single plant, whether it's coal, nuclear, or wind, goes offline for things like maintenance or unexpected problems. So the real question isn't whether renewables are intermittent, but how that compares to the downtime of our so-called reliable traditional power plants.
And here's the number that usually makes people pause. Those huge, large-scale fossil fuel and nuclear power plants, they're offline for maintenance or repairs somewhere between 7 and 12% of the time. This kind of challenges that whole idea that our traditional power grid is this perfectly consistent, always-on machine. It's just not true.
And this brings us to what's often the real issue. Take a blackout in Spain back in 2023. At first, everyone was quick to blame renewables, but when the official reports came out, they found the true culprit: an old, outdated grid that just couldn't handle normal fluctuations. This highlights a really crucial point. A lot of the time, the problem isn't the energy source itself, it's the aging infrastructure that's supposed to deliver it.
All right, let's shift gears to our next big concern, and it's a really important one: the impact on wildlife. We've all seen the headlines about birds and wind turbines, but what does the science say about how big this threat really is?
To really get a handle on the risk from wind turbines, you have to look at the bigger picture. According to conservation science, the top 3 threats to seabirds are, in order, climate change, invasive species like rats on nesting islands, and getting accidentally caught in fishing nets. Now, that's not to say turbines pose zero risk, but they aren't considered a primary driver of population decline compared to these other, much larger threats.
And check this out. This is a powerful statement from one of the world's leading bird protection agencies. The RSPB actually supports well-sited wind projects because they see climate change, which is fueled by burning fossil fuels, as the far, far greater danger to the survival of wildlife.
Okay, now we're going to turn to what is probably the most personal and definitely the most contentious concern: this claim that living near wind turbines can make people sick. It's an idea often called wind turbine syndrome.
So first, let's be super clear about what this term even means. Wind turbine syndrome is not a recognized medical diagnosis. It's a non-clinical, kind of a catch-all name for a collection of symptoms: headaches, dizziness, sleep problems that some people who live near turbines report feeling, and which they attribute to the turbines themselves.
So what does the science say? Well, scientific bodies all over the world have reviewed this stuff extensively. And as this summary shows, the weight of evidence suggests that things like infrasound, electromagnetic fields, and shadow flicker from properly sited turbines are not likely to cause any adverse health effects.
So what about the noise you can actually hear? Let's talk about sleep. In one study looking at rural areas, you can see that traffic and other mechanical sounds were pointed to as a source of sleep disturbance twice as often as wind turbines were.
So after combing through dozens and dozens of studies, what's the one crucial takeaway? The one consistent, scientifically supported connection isn't direct physical harm, it's annoyance. And this is most common when the noise from a turbine gets above 40 decibels, which, to put that in perspective, is about the sound level of a quiet library.
And that link, the one to annoyance, that right there opens up a really fascinating and pretty complex part of this story: the incredibly powerful role our minds can play in our physical well-being.
So we've all probably heard of the placebo effect, right? Where a positive belief can create a real positive outcome.
Well, this is its evil twin, the nocebo effect. It's a real phenomenon where negative expectations can actually cause someone to experience real negative symptoms.
And this is where the evidence gets, well, kind of mind-blowing. A study in Australia found something incredible. A full 73% of all health and noise complaints came from people living near just 6 specific wind farms. And what did those farms have in common? They were the exact same ones being targeted by organized anti-wind campaigns.
This led researchers to this really powerful hypothesis. They suggested the pattern of complaints looked less like a direct physical effect from the turbines and more like a communicated disease, where the spread of scary negative information itself creates the expectation of illness, which then drives people to report symptoms.
And this brings us to a critical finding. Study after study shows that a person's attitude toward a wind farm, whether they can see the turbines from their home, and whether they get any kind of financial benefit from it, all of those things are stronger predictors of annoyance than the actual sound level they're experiencing.
So what's the takeaway from all this? The science doesn't just point out problems, it actually points towards solutions. We have evidence-based best practices, like using sound-based limits instead of just arbitrary distances, and making sure the community is on board. These things can dramatically reduce conflict and annoyance.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question. The evidence seems to suggest that many of the perceived risks of renewables are actually a lot smaller than the very real, scientifically proven risks of climate change. So the challenge for all of us is this. In a world full of complex information, when our feelings about something new clash with the data, how do we decide which one to trust?
Thanks for joining.